For 23 years, Emily believed she had built the kind of marriage people quietly admired. She and Michael had raised children together, celebrated anniversaries, paid off a mortgage, weathered illnesses, job changes, and every ordinary challenge that comes with sharing a life. Friends often described Michael as dependable, the kind of husband who never forgot birthdays, always fixed what was broken around the house, and rarely gave anyone a reason to question his honesty. If someone had asked Emily whether she trusted her husband completely, she would have answered without hesitation. Then, on an ordinary rainy afternoon, while gathering clothes from the laundry room, a small piece of paper slipped from the pocket of Michael's jacket and floated onto the floor. At first it looked like nothing more than another receipt waiting to be thrown away. But when she unfolded it, one line stopped her cold. The receipt showed a restaurant in Buffalo, New York, dated just 2 nights earlier. The problem was impossible to ignore. Michael had called her that same evening, telling her he was attending a business conference in Indianapolis. He had even complained about the hotel, joked about the long meetings, and promised to bring home her favorite chocolates from the airport gift shop. None of it matched the paper trembling in her hands. In that single moment, every memory she had trusted suddenly felt uncertain. Every late meeting, every weekend business trip, every delayed flight, and every excuse she had accepted without question began replaying inside her mind in a completely different light. The moment I unfolded that receipt, I realized I had been married to a man I didn't actually know. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Emily wanted to believe there had to be a simple explanation. People make mistakes. Receipts get mixed up. Credit cards are sometimes used by coworkers. She repeated every reasonable possibility she could think of, hoping one of them would calm the growing unease in her chest. Yet the more she stared at that faded receipt, the harder it became to explain away. Buffalo was hundreds of miles from Indianapolis. This wasn't a neighboring town or a wrong highway exit. It was an entirely different destination. As the rain continued tapping against the windows, Emily stood perfectly still, holding a tiny piece of paper that suddenly carried the weight of an entire marriage. She had no idea that this ordinary receipt would lead her across state lines, introduce her to people she never imagined existed, and uncover a secret that had remained hidden for years. The question that refused to leave her mind was painfully simple. If Michael had lied about where he was, where had he really been, and who had he gone there to see? Emily didn't confront Michael that evening. Looking back, she would later say that silence felt safer than asking a question she wasn't prepared to have answered. She carefully folded the receipt and slipped it into the back of a kitchen drawer, exactly where she kept old instruction manuals and expired warranties. An ordinary place hiding something that no longer felt ordinary. When Michael walked through the front door a few hours later, he looked exactly as he always did after returning from a work trip. He smiled, hugged her, asked about the kids, carried his suitcase upstairs, and complained about airport traffic. If there was guilt on his face, she couldn't see it. He laughed during dinner, talked about meetings that supposedly ran late in Indianapolis, and even handed her a small box of chocolates, just as he had promised over the phone. Emily smiled back, but every word he spoke felt different now. Instead of listening to what he was saying, she found herself paying attention to what he wasn't saying. He never mentioned Buffalo. He never corrected himself. He never hesitated. The lie, if it was a lie, came as naturally as breathing. That night, long after Michael had fallen asleep, Emily lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the last several years of their marriage in her mind. Strange moments she had ignored suddenly returned with startling clarity. There had been weekends when Michael insisted he had to leave on short notice because a client needed him. There were anniversaries interrupted by emergency phone calls, birthdays shortened by unexpected business trips, and holidays when he always seemed anxious to leave early the following morning. None of those moments had seemed unusual at the time. His career often demanded travel, and she had always admired his dedication to providing for the family. Now, however, each memory felt like a missing piece from a puzzle she had never realized she was solving. The receipt hadn't simply raised one question. It had opened the door to hundreds of them. The next morning, Emily did something she had never imagined herself doing. While Michael was in the shower, she picked up his phone. She wasn't searching because she wanted to invade his privacy. She was searching because, for the first time in more than 2 decades, she wasn't sure she knew the man sleeping beside her. The phone was locked. That wasn't unusual. Most people protected their devices. But when Michael walked back into the bedroom and casually slipped the phone into his pocket before finishing his coffee, Emily noticed something she had overlooked for years. He never left that phone unattended anymore. Whether he was mowing the lawn, taking out the trash, or even walking to the mailbox, it was always with him. It seemed like a small habit, yet after finding that receipt, it no longer felt insignificant. Instead, it became another quiet detail adding to a growing list of questions she could no longer ignore. She still didn't know the answers, but she had reached one unavoidable conclusion. If the truth existed, it wasn't going to reveal itself on its own. She would have to find it herself. The days that followed felt strangely normal, at least on the surface. Michael left for work at the usual time each morning, called during his lunch break, and returned home in time for dinner almost every evening. If someone had watched their family from across the street, they would have seen nothing unusual. They would have seen a husband mowing the lawn on Saturday, a wife tending to her flower beds, neighbors exchanging friendly waves, and grandchildren visiting on the weekends. It looked like the picture of a stable American family. But inside Emily's mind, every ordinary moment had become part of a quiet investigation. She stopped accepting explanations at face value. Instead, she began paying attention to the smallest details, the things most spouses would never think twice about. She noticed how Michael would step outside whenever his phone rang after 9 o'clock at night. She noticed that he sometimes smiled while reading messages, only to erase the expression the moment she entered the room. Even his travel bag seemed different now. He packed it himself and never asked for help, something she had once considered thoughtful but now viewed with growing suspicion. Emily decided she needed facts instead of assumptions. One afternoon, while organizing paperwork for tax season, she pulled out several months of credit card statements. At first, everything appeared routine: groceries, fuel, utility bills, hardware stores, restaurants close to home. Then a familiar name caught her attention. It was the same restaurant listed on the receipt she had found in Michael's jacket. The charge had been made using one of their shared credit cards. She kept flipping through older statements. There it was again, several months earlier. And again, different dates, same restaurant in Buffalo, New York. Her heartbeat quickened. This wasn't a one-time mistake or an accidental stop during a delayed flight. Someone had been returning to the same place over and over again. She grabbed a notebook and began writing down every date she could find. As she compared them with the family calendar hanging in the kitchen, a pattern slowly emerged. Every charge matched one of Michael's so-called business trips. The discovery left her with more questions than answers. Why would every work trip somehow lead to the same city? Why had he never mentioned Buffalo even once? His company had offices in several states, but none of them were located there. Emily knew because she had attended company picnics years earlier and remembered conversations about their regional branches. She considered calling his office, but stopped herself. If she was wrong, she could destroy years of trust with a single phone call. If she was right, she needed to understand the full picture before Michael realized she was asking questions. So she remained quiet. She smiled through dinners, listened to stories about meetings she no longer believed, and carefully added another page to the growing folder she had hidden in the back of her closet. By the end of that week, Emily had collected enough evidence to convince herself of one thing. Buffalo wasn't just another destination on Michael's schedule. It was somewhere he was choosing to go. The only mystery that remained was waiting for her there. Emily's secret folder continued to grow over the next several weeks. What had started with a single restaurant receipt now contained copies of credit card statements, handwritten notes, hotel charges, fuel purchases, and a calendar marked with circles and arrows connecting dates that once seemed unrelated. She never imagined herself becoming someone who documented her own husband's movements, yet every new discovery made it harder to stop. She wasn't looking for reasons to end her marriage. She was searching for a reason to save it. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she still hoped there would be a simple explanation that would make all of this disappear. But the evidence kept leading her in the opposite direction. One Saturday morning, while Michael was washing his truck in the driveway, Emily volunteered to clean the inside. He smiled, thanked her, and handed over the keys without hesitation. For a brief moment, she wondered if she had been wrong all along. If he had something to hide, why would he willingly let her search his vehicle? She vacuumed the seats, wiped down the dashboard, and emptied the storage compartments. Everything looked ordinary until she reached beneath the passenger seat. Tucked deep underneath was a small electronic toll transponder that didn't belong to the state where they lived. She stared at it for several seconds before turning it over in her hand. It was registered for highways used regularly by drivers traveling through western New York. Michael had never mentioned owning a second toll pass. In fact, whenever they traveled together, they always paid cash at toll booths because he insisted it was easier than signing up for an account. Now she realized that explanation had never made much sense. That evening, after Michael had gone to bed, Emily searched online to understand how the transponder worked. She learned that many drivers kept one permanently assigned to a vehicle, allowing them to pass through toll plazas without stopping. If Michael had one hidden in his truck, it suggested he had been making those trips often enough to justify having it. This wasn't an occasional detour during business travel. It looked more like a routine. Her mind raced as she remembered the mileage on the truck after each so-called conference. She had occasionally joked that he drove enough to wear out 3 vehicles in one lifetime. Michael always laughed and blamed long-distance clients. At the time, the explanation sounded reasonable. Now every extra mile carried new meaning. As the clock crept past midnight, Emily spread the documents across the dining room table. She connected dates, locations, and purchases like pieces of an enormous puzzle. Again and again, every trail pointed toward Buffalo. Every receipt, every toll charge, every fuel stop brought him closer to the same destination. She leaned back in her chair, exhausted, knowing she had reached a point where paperwork alone could take her no further. The answers she wanted weren't hidden in bank statements or receipts anymore. They were waiting in a city hundreds of miles away. For the first time since finding that receipt in Michael's jacket, Emily made a decision that frightened her almost as much as the truth itself. The next time Michael claimed he was leaving on another business trip, she wasn't going to stay home and wonder where he had gone. She was going to follow him. Over the next few days, Emily resisted the urge to do anything impulsive. More than once, she picked up her phone, ready to call Michael at work and ask him the question that had been echoing in her mind since the afternoon she found the receipt. Every time, she stopped herself before pressing the call button. If she confronted him now, she believed she would only receive another explanation, another carefully delivered story that sounded reasonable enough to quiet her concerns without answering them. 23 years of marriage had taught her that Michael was calm under pressure. He rarely raised his voice, rarely argued, and always seemed to have an answer for everything. If she wanted the truth, she would have to be patient. That was easier said than done. Patience is difficult when every ordinary moment begins to feel like part of a mystery. She found herself studying him in ways she never had before. At breakfast, she noticed how confidently he discussed upcoming meetings without ever checking his calendar. In the evenings, she watched him respond to text messages with quick glances before locking his phone and placing it face down on the table. When they watched television together, she noticed his attention drifting whenever his phone vibrated. None of these habits had appeared overnight. They had probably existed for years. The difference was that Emily had never been looking for them. Once trust begins to crack, even the smallest details demand attention. One Wednesday afternoon, while organizing paperwork in the home office, Emily came across an old storage box filled with family keepsakes. Inside were birthday cards, children's report cards, vacation brochures, faded postcards, and dozens of photographs stretching back over 2 decades. She wasn't searching for evidence anymore. She was searching for reassurance. She wanted to remind herself that the life they had built together was real. She smiled as she found a picture from their first family vacation to the Smoky Mountains. There was another from their daughter's high school graduation. then one from Christmas nearly 10 years earlier. Michael was smiling in every photograph, his arm wrapped around his family as though there was nowhere else he wanted to be. But then something caught her attention. She pulled out another photograph from a 4th of July barbecue. On the back, she had written the date in blue ink years earlier, a habit she had almost forgotten. According to the date, the picture had been taken on a weekend Michael later claimed he had spent attending an out-of-state leadership conference. Emily frowned. She walked to the kitchen and retrieved the notebook where she had begun recording his travel dates. She compared the two. The conference and the barbecue had taken place on the same weekend. At first, it seemed like proof that she had made a mistake. Then she looked more carefully. Michael wasn't actually in the photograph. His empty lawn chair sat beside everyone else, and she suddenly remembered what had happened that afternoon. He had arrived hours late, apologizing that his conference had ended earlier than expected and that he had driven straight to the barbecue without stopping to change clothes. At the time, everyone admired his effort. Now she wondered if he had been driving from somewhere entirely different. It was another tiny piece of a much larger puzzle. On its own, it proved nothing. But placed beside the Buffalo receipt, the repeated restaurant charges, and the hidden toll transponder, it became harder to dismiss. Emily wrote the date into her notebook and drew another line connecting it to the growing timeline she had created. The page was beginning to fill with circles, arrows, and handwritten notes. Looking at it from a distance, it resembled one of those investigation boards seen in documentaries, where every thread eventually leads back to a single unanswered question. That evening, Michael announced that he would be leaving again the following Tuesday for what he described as a 3-day regional planning conference. He sounded relaxed, almost rehearsed, explaining that several department managers would be attending and that the schedule would probably keep him busy until late each night. Emily smiled politely and asked the same questions she had always asked. "Will you be driving?" "Probably," he replied. "Flying would take longer with all the connections." "Where is it this time?" He barely hesitated before answering. "Indianapolis." Emily nodded as though the answer meant nothing. Inside, however, she felt her heartbeat quicken. She already knew what she was going to do. For the first time since the questions began, Emily wasn't going to stay behind and wait for Michael to come home with another story. This time, she intended to see where the road really took him. The following 6 days moved more slowly than any Emily could remember. Every morning she crossed another square off the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator, not because she was counting down to a holiday or a family celebration, but because each passing day brought her closer to a decision she never imagined making. She had spent nearly half her life trusting Michael without reservation. Now she was preparing to secretly follow the man she had promised to love for better or worse. The thought alone filled her with guilt. More than once she wondered whether she had become the dishonest one. She questioned herself constantly. Was she overreacting to a handful of coincidences? Was grief over the possibility of losing her marriage causing her to see patterns where none existed? Every time those doubts appeared, she opened the kitchen drawer, unfolded the Buffalo receipt, and read it again. The ink hadn't changed. Neither had the date. Neither had the city. Facts were stubborn things. As Tuesday approached, Emily quietly began making preparations that would have seemed ridiculous only a month earlier. She told her sister that she might need help watching the grandchildren later in the week if something unexpected came up. She checked the tires on her car, filled the gas tank, and packed a small overnight bag without telling anyone. She slipped a phone charger, bottled water, snacks, a notebook, and an extra sweater into the trunk. None of it felt dramatic. It felt practical. If Michael really was traveling to Indianapolis, she would know within a few hours, apologize to herself for doubting him, and return home before he ever realized she had left. She wanted nothing more than to discover she had been completely wrong. Tuesday morning arrived with the familiar routine that had defined their marriage for years. Michael kissed Emily goodbye, lifted his suitcase into the truck, and reminded her not to wait up because he expected a long drive. He sounded relaxed, even cheerful. Before climbing into the driver's seat, he smiled and said, "I'll call you when I get to the hotel." Emily smiled back, waved as he pulled away from the driveway, then waited exactly 5 minutes before walking to her own car. Her hands were trembling so badly that she had to stop and take a deep breath before inserting the key into the ignition. She wasn't chasing a stranger. She was following her husband. Keeping a safe distance proved more difficult than she expected. Morning traffic was heavy, and she was constantly afraid of losing sight of Michael's truck or getting too close. Every lane change made her nervous. Every red light felt like it might end the pursuit before it had truly begun. For nearly 2 hours, everything matched the story Michael had told her. The highway signs pointed west, the route appeared consistent with a trip toward Indianapolis, and Emily briefly considered turning around. Maybe this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Maybe Buffalo had been a mistake after all. Then, without warning, Michael activated his turn signal and exited onto a different interstate. Emily glanced at the overhead sign. The new highway didn't lead toward Indianapolis. It led northeast, toward New York. She felt her stomach tighten as she continued following from several cars behind. Mile after mile, the signs became impossible to ignore. Town names she had never expected to see appeared one after another. The farther they drove, the quieter Emily became. She switched off the radio without realizing it. The only sounds inside the car were the hum of the tires against the pavement and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She wasn't wondering anymore whether Michael had lied. She was wondering how big the lie really was. Hours later, Michael stopped at a small service plaza just off the interstate. Emily pulled into the lot several minutes afterward, parking far enough away that she hoped he wouldn't recognize her vehicle. From where she sat, she could see him walk inside carrying only his phone and wallet. He looked completely at ease, like someone making a routine trip he had taken many times before. There was no sign of anxiety, no hurried movements, no hesitation. That calmness unsettled Emily more than anything else. It suggested this journey wasn't unusual to him. It was familiar. She waited until he drove away again before restarting her engine. The road ahead was taking both of them closer to Buffalo. And although Emily still didn't know exactly what she would find there, she could no longer escape the feeling that, somewhere beyond the next few hours of highway, her entire life was about to divide into two parts. Everything she believed before this trip, and everything she would learn after it. The farther Emily drove, the more the familiar landscape gave way to places she had never seen before. Small towns slipped past her window, each one marked by weathered welcome signs, quiet neighborhoods, family-owned diners, and gas stations where travelers stopped for coffee before continuing their journeys. Under different circumstances, she might have enjoyed the drive. She and Michael had always talked about taking more road trips after retirement, exploring places they had never had time to visit while raising their family. Now every mile felt heavy. She wasn't chasing an adventure. She was following the possibility that her entire marriage had been built on a truth she had never been allowed to see. Several hours into the trip, Michael pulled into another service area. This time, Emily stayed even farther back. She parked near a row of tractor trailers and watched through her windshield as he stepped out of his truck. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't looking over his shoulder. He walked with the confidence of someone who had traveled this route countless times. He greeted the cashier inside the convenience store with a smile that seemed almost familiar, and when he returned carrying a cup of coffee, he exchanged a few friendly words with another customer before climbing back into his truck. Emily couldn't hear the conversation, but she noticed something that made her pause. The cashier waved goodbye to Michael as though recognizing a regular customer. That simple gesture lingered in her mind long after they were back on the highway. People don't usually recognize someone who visits only once or twice. How many times had Michael been here? The question stayed with her as the miles disappeared beneath the tires. She thought back to all the business trips she had helped him prepare for over the years. She remembered ironing his shirts the night before he left, packing extra medication in his suitcase when he caught a cold, reminding him to drive carefully during snowstorms, and staying awake until he called to say he had reached his hotel safely. Every memory that had once represented love and trust now carried another possibility. Had he really been working those nights? Or had he been driving this very road toward a life she knew nothing about? As afternoon faded into early evening, traffic became lighter. Michael exited the interstate and turned onto a state highway lined with old maple trees and quiet residential communities. Emily tightened her grip on the steering wheel. She checked the distance between their vehicles repeatedly, terrified that one wrong move might reveal she had been following him all day. Her heart pounded every time he slowed at an intersection, afraid he might glance into his rearview mirror and recognize her car. But he never did. He drove with the confidence of someone heading somewhere that felt like home. The neighborhoods gradually became more familiar to him than they were to Emily. He no longer relied on highway signs or paused at intersections to think about which direction to take. Every turn came naturally, left at one traffic light, right at another, through a quiet neighborhood filled with well-kept lawns, children's bicycles leaning against garages, and American flags hanging from front porches. Nothing about the place stood out. It looked like thousands of neighborhoods across the country. Families were walking their dogs. Children were riding scooters along the sidewalks. A man watered his front lawn while chatting with a neighbor across the street. Emily had expected something different. She wasn't sure what. Perhaps a hidden cabin in the woods, a secluded apartment, a motel on the edge of town. Instead, Michael was driving into an ordinary neighborhood where people clearly knew one another. He slowed near the end of a peaceful street. Without hesitation, he turned into the driveway of a modest two-story house with white siding and blue shutters. Emily instinctively continued driving until she reached the next corner. She parked where she could still see the house through a gap between two large oak trees. Then she waited. Michael stepped out of his truck. He didn't knock. He didn't ring the bell. He walked straight to the front door. A moment later, it opened from the inside before he even reached it. Emily remained frozen behind the steering wheel, hardly aware that the engine was still running. Her eyes never left the house. The front porch was neat, with two rocking chairs, hanging flower baskets, and a welcome mat that had clearly been there for years. Nothing about it looked temporary. Nothing suggested secrecy. It looked lived in, loved. As Michael stepped onto the porch, the woman who had opened the door smiled warmly. She didn't look surprised to see him. She didn't hesitate. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him in the familiar way only someone who had greeted him like that many times before would. It wasn't a quick embrace between old friends. It was comfortable, natural, and completely at ease. Michael smiled back before disappearing inside the house. Emily couldn't breathe. She wanted to convince herself there was still an explanation. Perhaps the woman was a relative she had never met. Maybe she was an old family friend. Maybe Michael had been helping someone through a difficult time and simply hadn't known how to explain it. Her mind desperately searched for possibilities that would preserve the life she believed she had. But deep inside, another voice was growing louder with every passing second. She stayed where she was for nearly 20 minutes. No one came back outside. No one left. The porch remained quiet except for a small wind chime moving gently in the evening breeze. Finally, the front door opened again. Emily leaned forward. A little girl, no older than 8 or 9, skipped out onto the porch holding a bright red ball. She laughed as she chased it across the front yard. Moments later, a younger boy followed, calling out, "Wait for me." Emily watched as the children played together on the grass. Then Michael stepped outside. The little girl saw him first. She ran straight toward him. Without slowing down, she threw her arms around his waist. Michael bent down, lifted her into the air, and spun her around while she laughed. The little boy grabbed his hand. The three of them walked toward a swing hanging from a large maple tree in the front yard. Emily felt every ounce of strength leave her body. There was no uncertainty anymore. No misunderstanding. No business meeting. No conference. No client. The way the children looked at Michael answered every question that words could not. They weren't greeting a visitor. They were greeting someone they loved. Someone they expected to come home. Tears blurred Emily's vision, but she couldn't force herself to look away. 23 years of memories flashed through her mind all at once. She remembered Michael teaching their own son to ride a bicycle, reading bedtime stories to their daughter, standing proudly at graduations, carving Thanksgiving turkey, hanging Christmas lights, and promising, over and over again, that family would always come first. Now she was watching him repeat those same moments with children she had never seen before. Her hands trembled as she reached for the notebook lying on the passenger seat. For several minutes, she simply stared at the blank page. Then, with shaking fingers, she wrote 4 words. He lives here too. The sentence was painfully simple, yet it carried more weight than every receipt, credit card statement, toll record, and late-night phone call she had collected over the past several weeks. She looked back toward the house. The woman had stepped onto the porch carrying a tray of drinks. Michael walked over and kissed her on the forehead before taking one of the glasses. The gesture lasted only a second, but it was enough. It wasn't the awkward affection of an affair. It wasn't the excitement of a secret romance. It was the quiet familiarity of people who shared an everyday life. Emily lowered her head onto the steering wheel and silently cried. She didn't know how long she remained there. 5 minutes. 10. Perhaps longer. When she finally looked up again, the sun had begun to disappear below the horizon, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. Lights were coming on inside nearby homes as families gathered for dinner. Across the street, a neighbor waved casually toward Michael, who smiled and waved back without hesitation. That single exchange raised yet another question Emily hadn't considered before. If the neighbors knew Michael, then how many other people knew him here? How many birthdays had he celebrated on this street? How many barbecues? How many school events? How many Christmas mornings? And perhaps the most painful question of all, how many times had he kissed Emily goodbye, only to drive here and hear another family call him home? Darkness settled over the neighborhood. Emily finally started her car. She didn't knock on the door. She didn't confront Michael. She didn't introduce herself to the woman or the children. In that moment, she realized that whatever decisions the adults had made, those children deserved to be spared the shock of a confrontation on their front lawn. Quietly, she pulled away from the curb and began the long drive home, replaying everything she had witnessed. The road felt endless. Somewhere along those miles, the questions that had consumed her for weeks were replaced by something even heavier. She no longer wondered whether Michael had lied. She knew he had. What she didn't know was how long the deception had lasted, how many people had been hurt by it, and whether the woman in Buffalo knew she wasn't the only wife. When Michael returned home 2 days later, he walked through the front door carrying the same suitcase, wearing the same easy smile, and telling the same familiar story about meetings that had run late. Emily listened quietly as he described restaurants, traffic, and hotel rooms in Indianapolis. She let him finish every sentence. Only then did she walk to the kitchen drawer, remove the Buffalo receipt, and place it on the table. Next to it, she laid the toll records, the credit card statements, and finally a photograph she had quietly taken from her car of Michael standing in the front yard with the children in Buffalo. Michael looked down at the table. For the first time in more than 2 decades, he had no explanation. The silence that followed lasted longer than any argument they had ever had. Eventually, Michael admitted that he had been living a second life for years. He confessed that what had begun as a relationship during frequent work travel had grown into another household, and instead of ending one life before starting another, he continued both through a web of lies, carefully planned schedules, and constant deception. The truth devastated everyone involved. Emily filed for divorce, and the legal process that followed uncovered financial records showing just how much effort had gone into maintaining 2 separate homes. The second woman was also confronted with the reality that she had been living a life built on false promises. Both families were left to deal with the emotional consequences of choices they had never made. Months later, Emily reflected on the hardest lesson she had ever learned. She said the greatest pain wasn't discovering that Michael loved someone else. It was realizing that trust, once broken, changes the meaning of memories you once treasured. Vacations, anniversaries, birthdays, and ordinary evenings around the dinner table all became questions instead of certainties. Yet she also refused to let betrayal define the rest of her life. She rebuilt relationships with her children, found strength in friends who stood beside her, and slowly accepted that healing doesn't come from forgetting the past. It comes from deciding that someone else's deception will not determine your future. Stories like this have surfaced across the United States over the years, reminding us that long-term deception can remain hidden for years when people place complete trust in those they love. While every family's circumstances are different, the emotional impact is often strikingly similar. Disbelief, grief, anger, and eventually, for many, the difficult work of moving forward. Before we end today's story, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think you would have noticed the warning signs any earlier? Or could someone truly hide a second family for years without those closest to them knowing? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy real-life documentary stories that explore trust, relationships, and the unexpected truths that change lives forever, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story.